The carriage wheels cracked against the frozen stone path, and Clara Whitmore felt her chest tighten as she watched the lanterns of her family's carriage grow smaller in the darkness. She was still standing at the bottom of the long driveway, her thin shawl doing nothing against the biting wind, while the people who were supposed to love her rode away without a single glance back. Minutes earlier, everything had seemed normal enough. Clara had spent the whole afternoon helping her stepsisters, Beatrice and Lucy, get ready for the grandest ball of the season. She had curled their hair, laced their gowns, and pinned jewels into place with careful, patient hands, even though her own dress was a simple, faded blue thing she had mended twice that month. She had not expected praise. She had learned long ago not to expect that from this family, but she had expected, at the very least, a seat in the carriage. Instead, when the final trunk was loaded and the horses were ready, her stepmother, Margaret, had turned to her with a look that was almost bored, as if she were discussing the weather rather than a person's evening. "There simply is not enough room," Margaret had said, smoothing the front of her gown. "You understand, don't you, Clara? 4 people and their skirts cannot possibly fit beside the driver." Clara had opened her mouth to argue, to point out that the carriage had carried 5 people the previous winter without complaint, but Lucy had already climbed inside, giggling at something Beatrice whispered, and the door had shut before Clara could form the words. She had stood on the gravel, watching the wheels turn, waiting for someone to stop, to call her name, to tell her it was only a joke. No one did. The cold settled into her bones as she stood there, staring at the empty road long after the carriage had disappeared around the bend. She thought about her father, who had left for the ball earlier that day on business with the other gentlemen, unaware, she told herself, unaware that his wife had chosen to strand his only daughter outside their own home on the night of the season's most important event. She wanted to believe he did not know. She wanted to believe there was still one person in that house who cared whether she froze on the driveway or not. But some quiet, tired part of her had stopped being surprised a long time ago. Clara wrapped her arms around herself and began to walk. The ballroom was nearly 2 miles away at the grand estate of Ashcombe, and she had no coat, no carriage, and no invitation clutched in her hand, because Margaret had misplaced it that morning with a smile that told Clara exactly how deliberate the mistake had been. She did not know why she kept walking. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps it was simply that standing still in the cold felt worse than moving through it. Either way, her thin shoes crunched over the frost-covered path, and she told herself that she would turn back before she reached the gates, that there was no reasonable version of tonight where she, in her patched dress and wind-blown hair, walked into a ballroom filled with the finest families in the country. And yet she kept walking. The trees along the road stood bare and silver in the moonlight, and somewhere behind them an owl called out, low and steady, as though marking the hour. Clara's breath came out in small white clouds, and by the time the lights of Ashcombe Hall came into view, glowing gold against the black sky, her fingers had gone numb inside her thin gloves. She stopped at the edge of the long drive, staring up at the enormous windows, at the shapes of dancers moving behind the glass, at the warmth and laughter she could almost hear from where she stood. She had never seen anything so beautiful, and she had never felt so far away from anything in her life. Clara sat down on a low stone wall near the gates, out of sight of the arriving carriages, and pulled her knees up toward her chest to keep warm. She told herself she would just rest a moment before starting the long walk home. Her feet ached, her fingers stung, and something in her throat felt tight and raw, though she refused to let herself cry. Crying had never once fixed anything in that house. She had learned that lesson the hard way, more times than she cared to count. She thought of her mother, gone now for 6 years, and wondered, not for the first time, what her life might have looked like if she had lived. Her mother had been kind in a way that Margaret never bothered to imitate, warm in a way that made even the coldest winters feel bearable. Clara still remembered her mother's voice, soft and steady, telling her that kindness was never wasted, even when it went unnoticed. Clara wanted to believe that. Some nights it was the only thing that kept her from giving up entirely. Carriage after carriage rolled past the gates, spilling out ladies in silk and gentlemen in fine coats, their laughter drifting across the cold air like something from another world. Clara watched them from her spot on the wall, half hidden by the shadow of an old oak tree, and felt no bitterness toward them, only a quiet, aching loneliness. She did not belong among them tonight. She was not even certain she belonged anywhere at all. It was the sound of hooves slowing, rather than speeding past, that finally caught her attention. Most carriages rolled straight through the gates without pause, eager to reach the warmth and music inside. This one stopped. Clara lifted her head, startled, as a dark, elegant carriage came to rest only a few feet from where she sat. The horses stamped and snorted softly in the cold, their breath rising in pale clouds, and for a moment nothing happened at all. Clara considered slipping further into the shadows, embarrassed to be seen sitting alone on a wall like some forgotten piece of furniture left out in the weather. But before she could move, the carriage door opened. A man stepped down, tall and composed, wearing a dark coat that fit him with the kind of precision only the wealthiest tailors could manage. Clara could not see his face clearly in the dim light, only the outline of him, straight-backed and still, studying her with an expression she could not read. "You are sitting outside in the cold," he said, his voice calm, neither warm nor unkind, simply observant, as though stating a fact rather than starting a conversation. Clara straightened instinctively, smoothing her skirt over her knees, suddenly aware of how she must look, wind-blown and shivering, with no carriage of her own and no invitation to offer as explanation. "I am only resting," she said, hoping her voice did not shake as much as she felt it did. "I will be on my way shortly." The man did not move. "On your way to where? The ball is behind you, not ahead." Clara hesitated, unsure how much to say to a stranger, especially one dressed as finely as this, standing outside the very event she had no right to attend. "I am not going inside," she said finally. "I was simply passing by." It was not entirely a lie, she told herself. She had, after all, walked the whole distance without any real plan of going further than the gates. The stranger tilted his head slightly, studying her with a quiet intensity that made her want to look away, and yet somehow kept her still. "It is the coldest night of the season," he said, "and you are sitting alone on a stone wall in a gown far too thin for this weather, 2 miles from anywhere warm. Forgive me if I find that difficult to believe." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks despite the cold. She was not used to being seen so plainly, not used to anyone noticing the details of her life closely enough to question them. At home she had become nearly invisible, a shadow moving through rooms unnoticed unless something needed doing. To be studied like this, so directly, so carefully, unsettled her in a way she did not fully understand. "My family attended the ball without me," she admitted at last, deciding there was little use in pretending otherwise to a man who had clearly already guessed the truth. There was not enough room in the carriage. Something shifted in the stranger's expression, though Clara could not name what it was. Not quite pity, she thought. Something closer to quiet disapproval, though whether it was directed at her family or at the situation itself, she could not tell. "That seems an unusual excuse," he said, "for leaving someone behind on a night this cold." Clara looked down at her hands, twisting the edge of her shawl between her fingers. "It is not the first unusual excuse I have heard," she said quietly, before she could stop herself. The wind picked up, cutting through the thin fabric of her dress, and she shivered despite her best efforts to hide it. The stranger noticed, of course. He seemed to notice everything. "You will catch your death sitting out here," he said, and for the first time something almost gentle entered his voice. "Come. There is warmth inside, and I imagine a great deal more comfort than this wall can offer." Clara blinked up at him, certain she had misheard. "I could not possibly," she said quickly. "I have no invitation. I am not dressed for such an event. I would only embarrass myself and you for even suggesting it." "I did not ask whether you were dressed for it," he said simply. "I asked you to come inside out of the cold." There was something in the way he said it, plain and direct, without any trace of mockery or false kindness, that made Clara believe he meant exactly what he said and nothing more. She searched his face for some hint of a joke, some sign that this was merely a cruel game at her expense, the sort of thing Beatrice and Lucy might have arranged for their own amusement. But she found none, only steady, patient waiting. "I do not even know your name," she said softly, stalling for time she was not sure she needed. "Alexander," he said. "Duke of Ashcombe." Clara's breath caught in her throat. Of course. The very estate glowing gold behind him, filled with music and laughter, belonged to the man standing before her. The host of the ball she had no right to attend was the same man who had stopped his carriage for a stranger sitting alone in the cold. "And you?" he asked when she said nothing. "Clara," she managed, "Clara Whitmore." He nodded once, as though committing the name to memory, and extended his hand toward her, palm open, patient, without any pressure behind the gesture. Clara looked at it for a long moment, feeling the cold bite at her fingers, feeling the warmth and light of the ballroom pulling at something inside her chest despite every reasonable thought telling her to refuse. She thought of her stepmother's carriage rolling away without her. She thought of the empty road behind her and the long walk home that awaited if she refused this strange, unexpected kindness. And she thought, too, of her mother's voice, soft and certain, telling her that kindness was never wasted, even when it came from the most unexpected places. Slowly, Clara reached out and placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, steady and sure, and for the first time since the carriage wheels had cracked against the frozen path and left her behind, Clara felt something other than cold settle over her. She did not know what tonight would bring, or what it would mean for a girl in a patched blue dress to walk through the doors of Ashcombe Hall on the arm of its duke. But as he helped her to her feet and turned toward the glowing windows and the music spilling out into the night, she found that, for once, she was not afraid to find out. Alexander did not release her hand right away. Instead, he guided her toward the carriage, where a footman waited with a heavy woolen blanket, as though such a need had been anticipated before Clara had ever spoken a word. She wrapped it around her shoulders gratefully, feeling warmth begin to seep back into her fingers for the first time in what felt like hours. "You keep blankets in your carriage for strangers on the road?" she asked, unable to help the small note of disbelief in her voice. "I keep blankets in my carriage for cold nights," Alexander said simply, settling across from her as the door closed. Tonight, it happened to be a stranger who needed one. Clara pulled the blanket tighter, studying him in the dim light of the carriage lamp. He did not look at her the way other men of his standing sometimes looked at women in her position, with a kind of careless curiosity, as though she were an oddity to be examined and then dismissed. He simply watched the road ahead, calm and unreadable, as though escorting an uninvited stranger into the grandest ball of the season was the most ordinary thing in the world. "You must think me very foolish," Clara said quietly, "sitting outside in the cold instead of simply walking home." "I think," Alexander said, after a moment's consideration, "that you were left with very few good choices tonight, and you made the best one available to you. There is nothing foolish in that." Clara looked down at her hands, unsure how to respond to such plain, unexpected understanding. She was used to being scolded for things far smaller than this, used to being told that her troubles were the result of her own carelessness, even when the fault lay clearly elsewhere. To be met instead with quiet reason felt strange, almost uncomfortable, like a shoe that did not yet fit but might in time if she let it. The carriage rolled to a stop at the base of the wide stone steps leading up to Ashcombe Hall, and Clara's stomach twisted into a tight knot as she looked out the window at the grand entrance, lit by dozens of glowing lanterns. Guests were still arriving, their laughter and chatter drifting across the courtyard, and Clara felt suddenly, painfully aware of her plain blue dress and wind-blown hair among all that silk and polish. "I cannot go in there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Look at me. I will only bring embarrassment to your name appearing beside you looking as I do." Alexander studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "Do you believe," he said finally, "that a person's worth is measured by the quality of their dress?" Clara opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again, uncertain. "I do not," he continued, before she could find the words, "and I have little patience for those who do." You are cold, you are tired, and you have been treated unkindly tonight by people who ought to have known better. None of that will be improved by you walking 2 miles home in the dark while the rest of the world dances in the warmth. Come inside. No one will trouble you while you are beside me." There was something quietly resolute in the way he said it, as though the matter were already settled and further argument would be a waste of both their time. Clara found herself nodding before she had fully decided to agree, and when the footman opened the carriage door, she allowed Alexander to help her down onto the stone steps, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders like a shield against the cold and the stairs she was certain would follow. They did not follow, at least not immediately. The other guests were too occupied with their own arrivals, too busy adjusting gloves and smoothing skirts, to pay much attention to the Duke and the unfamiliar young woman beside him. Clara allowed herself a small breath of relief as they climbed the steps together, though she knew it would not last. It never did. Inside, the entrance hall of Ashcombe glowed with candlelight, the walls lined with paintings and mirrors that seemed to multiply the warmth and brightness 100 times over. Clara had never seen a room so grand, not even in her own home during its better years, and for a moment she simply stood still, taking it in, forgetting for the briefest instant that she did not belong. "Your cloak," a servant said gently, appearing at her side, and Clara realized with a small jolt that she was still wrapped in the woolen blanket from the carriage. She glanced up at Alexander, unsure what to do, and he gave a small nod toward the servant, a silent permission that put her at ease. She handed over the blanket, smoothing her simple dress with hands that trembled only slightly now. "This way," Alexander said, offering his arm. Clara hesitated only a moment before taking it, feeling the eyes of a passing group of ladies flicker toward them with open curiosity. She kept her chin lifted, the way her mother had once taught her, though her heart pounded so hard she was certain everyone around her could hear it. As they walked deeper into the hall, the sound of music grew louder, weaving through the chatter and laughter of the guests already gathered. Clara caught glimpses of gowns in every shade imaginable, jewels catching the candlelight, and gentlemen bowing over gloved hands with practiced elegance. It was every bit as magnificent as she had imagined while standing outside the gates, and every bit as terrifying now that she stood within it. "You seem troubled," Alexander observed, glancing down at her as they walked. "I am trying very hard not to seem it," Clara admitted, managing a small, tired smile. A faint, almost imperceptible curve touched the corner of his mouth, the first hint of anything resembling warmth she had seen from him since the moment his carriage had stopped beside the stone wall. "You are doing a fine job of it," he said. "Better than most who arrive here nervous and overwhelmed, though they have every advantage of preparation that you did not." They passed beneath a wide archway into the main ballroom, and Clara felt her breath catch entirely. The room stretched before her, vast and glittering, with towering windows draped in deep velvet curtains and enormous chandeliers casting warm golden light across the dancing couples below. Musicians played from a raised platform at the far end, their music rich and full, filling every corner of the enormous space. Clara had never imagined a room so beautiful, and for a moment she forgot her fear entirely, simply staring in quiet wonder at the world she now stood inside. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "It is," Alexander agreed, though when Clara glanced up at him, she found him watching her rather than the room itself. She looked away quickly, feeling heat rise in her cheeks for reasons that had nothing to do with the temperature of the crowded ballroom. Around them, heads were beginning to turn, small ripples of attention spreading outward as more and more guests noticed the Duke of Ashcombe standing at the edge of the dance floor with a young woman none of them recognized. "They are staring," Clara murmured, keeping her eyes fixed determinedly on the dancers ahead rather than the curious faces turning their way. "They often stare," Alexander said, unconcerned. "It is one of the few reliable habits of a crowded ballroom." Clara could not help the small, surprised laugh that escaped her, quickly covering her mouth as though she had done something improper. Alexander's expression shifted again, something almost pleased flickering briefly across his features before settling back into its usual calm composure. "There," he said quietly, That is a far better look for you than the fear you walked in with." Clara felt her cheeks warm further, uncertain how to respond to such a direct observation. She was not accustomed to being noticed in such a way, not accustomed to anyone paying close enough attention to her expressions to comment on them at all. At home, she was simply useful or invisible, depending on the day. Here, standing beside a man who seemed to see her clearly despite having known her for less than an hour, she felt strangely, uncomfortably visible. A group of young women stood near one of the tall windows, their heads bent together in quiet conversation, eyes flicking repeatedly toward Clara and Alexander with poorly disguised curiosity. Clara recognized none of them, though she suspected, from the fine cut of their gowns and the easy confidence in their posture, that they belonged to families far more established than her own had ever been, even before its recent troubles. "Do you know them?" she asked quietly, nodding subtly toward the group. "By name, yes," Alexander said. "By character, less certainly. It is often difficult to tell the difference between genuine warmth and practiced charm in rooms like this one." Clara considered that for a moment, turning the thought over carefully. "And which do I offer?" she asked, surprising herself with the boldness of the question. Alexander regarded her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. "I have known you less than an hour," he said, "and yet I find myself far more curious about the answer to that question than I have been about anyone else in this room all evening." Before Clara could think of a suitable response, the musicians shifted into a new piece, the opening notes rising clear and bright above the chatter of the crowd. Around them, couples began moving toward the center of the floor, arranging themselves in neat, practiced lines for the next dance. Clara felt a fresh wave of panic rise in her chest, certain that whatever strange kindness had brought her this far was about to reach its natural end. But Alexander did not release her arm. Instead, he turned to face her fully, his expression calm and unreadable, though something steady and certain lived behind his eyes. "I do not know how to dance properly," Clara admitted quickly, before he could say whatever he seemed poised to say. "I have never had the opportunity to learn, not truly. I would only embarrass you further and myself besides." "Then we shall simply move together," Alexander said, "and worry very little about whether it is done properly." Clara stared up at him, certain she had misunderstood. "You cannot mean to ask me to dance," she said. "Not here, not in front of everyone." "I mean exactly that," he said, and extended his hand toward her for the second time that night, palm open, patient, and utterly certain. Clara glanced around the ballroom, at the curious faces already turned in their direction, at the elegant lines of dancers waiting for the music to fully begin, and felt her heart pound with a fear that was, for the first time in a long while, tangled up with something that felt dangerously close to hope. She thought of the empty road behind her, of the carriage that had left without her, of the cold stone wall where she had sat certain that tonight would end in quiet, forgotten disappointment. Instead, here she stood, in the middle of the most magnificent ballroom she had ever seen, with the Duke of Ashcombe's hand extended toward her own. Slowly, deliberately, Clara placed her hand in his once more, and allowed him to lead her out onto the floor. The music swelled around them as they took their places at the head of the forming line, and Clara felt every eye in the ballroom settle upon her at once. She had never in her life stood at the center of so much attention, and for a moment her feet refused to move at all, frozen in place despite the steady warmth of Alexander's hand resting lightly against hers. "Follow my lead," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it beneath the rising music. "It is simpler than it appears. Step, turn, step again. I will not let you stumble." Clara swallowed hard and nodded, fixing her eyes on his rather than the sea of curious faces surrounding them. The first notes carried them forward, and to her own surprise, her feet found the rhythm almost on instinct, guided as much by the steady pressure of his hand as by the music itself. She stepped when he stepped, turned when he turned, and slowly, cautiously, allowed herself to believe that she might survive this dance without disgracing either of them. Around the edges of the ballroom, whispers multiplied like sparks catching dry grass. Clara could not hear the words clearly, but she did not need to. She had grown up surrounded by whispered judgments, and she recognized the shape of them even from a distance. The tilted heads, the fans raised halfway to hide moving lips, the eyes that darted toward her and quickly away again when she glanced back. "They are wondering who I am," she said quietly, as Alexander turned her gently beneath his raised arm. "They are," he agreed, "and by tomorrow morning half of them will have invented an answer far more interesting than the truth." "And what is the truth?" Clara asked, unable to help herself. Alexander considered the question as they moved through the next step, his expression thoughtful rather than evasive. "The truth," he said finally, "is that I found a young woman abandoned in the cold by people who ought to have protected her, and I could not, in good conscience, leave her there. I do not know yet what else the truth will become. That, I suspect, depends a great deal on the choices we make from here forward." Something in his words settled warm and steady in Clara's chest, though she could not name exactly why. She had spent so many years being defined entirely by other people's choices, by Margaret's carelessness, by her stepsister's cruelty disguised as playful teasing, by her father's quiet, exhausted absence from the small daily battles of their household. To hear someone speak of choice as something still open to her, still hers to shape, felt almost foreign and entirely welcome. The dance carried them the length of the floor and back again, weaving between the other couples with a grace Clara had not believed herself capable of only minutes before. She began slowly to relax into the rhythm, to trust the steady guidance of Alexander's hand, to forget, for brief stretches at a time, the hundreds of watching eyes and simply feel the music moving through her. "You dance far better than you believed you would," Alexander observed, as they turned once more beneath the glittering chandeliers. "I had a very patient teacher," Clara replied, and was rewarded with that same faint curve at the corner of his mouth she had noticed earlier, warmer this time, less guarded. Near the edge of the dance floor, a cluster of young women watched with open, unguarded curiosity, their earlier whispers growing bolder now that the dance was well underway. Clara recognized one of them as a young woman she had glimpsed occasionally at smaller gatherings over the years, a distant acquaintance of her stepsister's, though they had never properly spoken. The woman's eyes met Clara's briefly across the room, and rather than the scorn Clara half expected, she found something closer to surprised curiosity looking back at her. "You seem to know that woman," Alexander said, following her gaze. "Only distantly," Clara admitted. "Her name is Charlotte, I believe. She has attended some of the same gatherings as my stepsisters over the years, though we have never truly spoken." "Perhaps tonight will change that," Alexander said, and there was something almost knowing in the way he said it, as though he could already see the shape of the evening unfolding in ways Clara had not yet begun to imagine. As the dance continued, Clara found herself studying the other couples moving around them, noting the practiced elegance of their steps, the easy confidence with which they navigated the crowded floor. She had spent countless evenings watching such gatherings from the edges, helping her stepsisters prepare for balls she would never attend herself, listening to their excited chatter about partners and dances and the small, glittering dramas of high society. She had never once imagined she might find herself standing in the very center of such a moment, and certainly never on the arm of the ball's own host. "May I ask you something?" Clara said, as the music began to slow toward its natural conclusion. "You may," Alexander said. "Why did you truly stop your carriage tonight?" she asked. "There were surely a dozen reasonable excuses available to you. Had you simply wished to continue on toward your own event without concerning yourself with a stranger on the road." Alexander was quiet for a moment, his expression growing more thoughtful, more careful, as though weighing exactly how much of an answer he wished to give. "I have attended a great many balls in my life," he said finally, "and grown quite tired of the practiced smiles and careful performances that fill them. There was nothing practiced about the way you looked, sitting on that wall in the cold." It was the first honest thing I had encountered all evening, long before we ever exchanged a single word. Clara felt something tighten in her throat, unexpected and warm, and found she had no ready response to offer in return. The music drew to its final notes, and the dancers around them began to slow, dropping into polite bows and curtsies as the piece concluded. Alexander released her hand gently, though he did not step away, remaining close beside her as the applause rippled softly through the room. "Thank you," Clara said quietly, once the noise had settled enough for her words to carry. "For the dance and for everything before it. I do not know how I would have managed this evening without your kindness." "You give me too much credit," Alexander said. "I suspect you would have managed a great many things tonight entirely on your own, given the circumstance. I simply made the walk shorter." Before Clara could respond, a new ripple of movement caught her attention near the entrance of the ballroom, and her stomach dropped as she recognized the familiar shapes moving through the crowd. Margaret's unmistakable posture, upright and severe, cut through the gathered guests with practiced ease, followed closely by Beatrice and Lucy, both dressed in gowns finer than anything Clara had ever worn in her life. Clara's breath caught, old instincts of caution and quiet dread rising immediately to the surface, though she forced herself to stand steady rather than shrink away as she might once have done. Beside her, Alexander followed her gaze, his expression shifting subtly into something more alert, more watchful, though his posture remained perfectly composed. "Your family, I take it," he said quietly. "Yes," Clara said, her voice tight. "I imagine they will be quite surprised to find me here." "Then let us not disappoint their expectations," Alexander said, and to Clara's astonishment, he offered his arm once more, guiding her steadily forward, directly toward the very people who had left her shivering on a cold stone wall only hours before. Margaret's eyes found Clara across the crowded room, and for one brief, satisfying moment, Clara watched genuine shock crack through her stepmother's carefully composed expression before it smoothed itself back into practiced pleasantness. Beatrice's mouth fell open slightly, her earlier giggling laughter dying instantly at the sight of her stepsister, standing beside the very duke whose ball they had all come to attend. "Clara," Margaret said, her voice pitched carefully for the benefit of the surrounding guests, sweet and light in a way that did not match the sharp warning flickering behind her eyes. "What a surprise to find you here. I did not realize you had managed to arrange transportation after all." "I did not need to arrange it," Clara said evenly, keeping her voice as calm and pleasant as her stepmother's own. "His Grace was kind enough to notice I had been left behind, and offered his assistance." A flicker of alarm passed across Margaret's face before she could fully suppress it, her gaze flicking briefly toward Alexander, gauging exactly how much he might already know, and exactly how dangerous that knowledge might prove to be for her families standing among the very people gathered in this room. "Left behind," Alexander repeated, his tone mild, almost conversational, though there was a quiet edge beneath it that Clara had not heard from him before. "An unusual oversight, given the season's coldest night and a journey of some 2 miles between your home and mine." Margaret's smile tightened at the corners, though she held it in place with practiced discipline. "A simple misunderstanding," she said smoothly. "We assumed Clara had made other arrangements. Had we known otherwise, we would never have left without her." Clara felt the familiar, tired urge to simply nod along, to smooth over the moment and avoid the confrontation that some old, cautious part of her still feared more than the cold itself. But standing here now, warmed by the ballroom, steadied by Alexander's presence beside her, she found she no longer wished to make things easier for the people who had never once made things easier for her. "There was no misunderstanding," Clara said quietly, but clearly enough for those nearby to hear. "I asked and I was told there was no room." A hush rippled outward among the small cluster of guests who had drawn close enough to overhear the exchange, and Clara watched, with a strange mixture of satisfaction and discomfort, as Margaret's composure began, ever so slightly, to fracture beneath the weight of so many watching eyes. "Perhaps," Alexander said smoothly, before Margaret could formulate a response, "this is a conversation better suited to a quieter corner of the evening, rather than the center of the dance floor." Margaret seized the offered escape gratefully, inclining her head in stiff agreement, though the look she cast toward Clara as she turned away carried a warning far sharper than anything spoken aloud. Beatrice and Lucy trailed after their mother, exchanging uneasy glances, their earlier confidence noticeably dampened. Clara let out a slow breath as the small group retreated, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease only slightly. Around her, the ballroom's music had resumed, couples once again moving through their practice steps as though nothing unusual had occurred at all, though Clara could still feel the lingering weight of curious eyes and hushed conversations following her every movement. "You did not have to do that," she said quietly to Alexander, once the immediate crowd had dispersed back into the wider swirl of the evening. "You did not have to draw such attention to their behavior in front of everyone." "I did not do it for their benefit," Alexander said simply. "I did it because you deserved, at the very least, to have the truth spoken aloud once, in a room full of people who might otherwise never have known it." Clara looked up at him, searching his composed expression for some sign of ulterior motive, some hint that his kindness tonight was merely a performance for an audience he understood far better than she did. But she found only steady, quiet sincerity looking back at her, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara allowed herself to simply accept a kindness without immediately searching for its hidden cost. "Thank you," she said again, softer this time. "You are welcome," Alexander said. "Though I suspect this evening is far from finished, Miss Whitmore, and I imagine your family will not let the matter rest quite so easily." Clara glanced once more toward the far side of the ballroom, where Margaret stood in tense conversation with her daughters, their heads bent close together, voices too low to carry across the distance. Whatever plans were forming behind that carefully composed exterior, Clara knew from long experience that they would not be kind ones. But standing here now, in the warmth and light of Ashcombe Hall, with the memory of the first dance still humming pleasantly through her tired feet, Clara found that she was, for the first time in a very long while, not entirely afraid of what came next. Margaret did not approach again for the better part of an hour, though Clara caught her watching from across the room more than once, her expression carefully neutral for the benefit of anyone who might be observing, though the tightness around her eyes told a different story entirely. Clara had grown up learning to read that particular tightness, the quiet promise of a conversation yet to come, one that would not be nearly so gentle once they were away from public eyes. She tried, for a while, to simply enjoy the evening as it unfolded around her. Alexander introduced her to a handful of his acquaintances, gentlemen and ladies who greeted her with polite curiosity rather than open suspicion, and Clara found herself relaxing gradually into conversations about music and travel and the unusually cold weather that had settled over the county in recent weeks. It was, she realized with some surprise, the first time in years she had been permitted to simply exist in a room without being measured against her stepsisters, without being reminded of some duty left undone. But the reprieve did not last. She noticed Beatrice approaching first, weaving through the crowd with a smile fixed too tightly in place, the kind of smile Clara recognized as a warning rather than a welcome. Alexander had stepped away briefly to speak with another guest, and Clara found herself, for a moment, standing alone as her stepsister closed the distance between them. "You certainly know how to make a spectacle of yourself," Beatrice said quietly, once she was close enough that only Clara could hear. "Mother is furious, you know. Do you have any idea what you have done tonight?" "I have done nothing," Clara said evenly, refusing to let her voice waver. "I was left in the cold and a kind man offered his help. That is the whole of it." "That is not the whole of it, and you know it," Beatrice hissed, glancing quickly over her shoulder to ensure no one stood close enough to overhear. "You have humiliated us in front of half the county. Do you understand what that means for Lucy's prospects? For mine? No respectable family will wish to associate with us if word spreads that we left our own stepdaughter freezing on the road." Clara felt a flash of something sharp and unfamiliar rise in her chest, a feeling she did not immediately recognize as anger, having so rarely been permitted to express it freely in her own home. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "you ought to have considered that before you left me there." Beatrice's mouth tightened, and for a moment Clara thought she might respond with something cutting and cruel, the way she so often did when cornered. Instead, something flickered across her expression that Clara did not expect. Not quite guilt, but something adjacent to it, uncertain and uneasy. "You do not understand the situation," Beatrice said finally, her voice dropping even lower. "There are things happening at home that you know nothing about. Mother has her reasons for wanting you kept quiet, kept out of sight. It was never truly about the carriage." Clara's stomach tightened at the strange shift in her stepsister's tone. "What things?" she asked carefully. "What reasons?" But before Beatrice could answer, if she had even intended to, Margaret appeared at her daughter's side, her hand closing firmly around Beatrice's arm. "That is quite enough," Margaret said, her voice sweet and sharp all at once, like sugar coating something bitter beneath. "Beatrice, go find your sister. I will handle things here." Beatrice's eyes flicked once more toward Clara, something almost apologetic passing briefly across her face, before she turned and disappeared back into the crowd, leaving Clara alone with her stepmother for the first time since the confrontation on the dance floor. Margaret studied Clara for a long moment, her expression carefully composed, though Clara could see the effort it cost her to maintain such calm. "You have caused quite a scene tonight," Margaret said finally. "I hope you are proud of yourself." "I did not cause anything," Clara said, standing her ground despite the old, familiar instinct to shrink beneath her stepmother's cool gaze. "I was left behind. That is not a scene of my making." "You could have simply gone home," Margaret said, her voice tightening. "Instead, you paraded yourself in front of the entire county on the arm of the Duke of Ashcombe, embarrassing this family in the process. Do you have any idea what you have risked tonight?" "What have I risked?" Clara said quietly. "That you were not already prepared to lose the moment you decided leaving me in the cold was an acceptable choice." Margaret's expression flickered, something sharp and calculating passing behind her eyes before she smoothed it away once more. "You are naive if you believe kindness from a duke changes anything about your circumstances," she said. "Men like him amuse themselves with novelty for an evening and forget it entirely by morning. You would do well to remember your place before you embarrass yourself further." The words stung more than Clara wished to admit, old fears rising unbidden despite everything the evening had already shown her. She thought of Alexander's steady hand guiding her through the dance, the quiet sincerity in his voice when he spoke of honesty, and told herself firmly that Margaret's words were meant to wound rather than to speak any real truth. "Perhaps," Clara said, keeping her voice steady despite the tremor she felt beneath it, "you ought to worry less about my place, and more about explaining to His Grace exactly why I was left freezing outside your carriage tonight." Margaret's composure cracked, just slightly, just enough for Clara to see the flash of genuine alarm beneath it before it vanished again behind practiced calm. "You would not dare embarrass this family further," she said, her voice low and tight. "I have not embarrassed anyone," Clara said. "I have simply told the truth. If the truth embarrasses you, perhaps that says more about your choices than mine." For a moment, the two women simply stared at one another, the noise of the ballroom fading into the background of Clara's awareness, as she held her ground against a woman who had controlled so much of her life for so many years. She did not know where this new steadiness had come from, this quiet refusal to shrink beneath Margaret's familiar disapproval, but she suspected it had something to do with the warmth still lingering from Alexander's dance, the simple, unfamiliar experience of being treated as though her feelings mattered. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, Alexander returned to Clara's side, his presence settling calmly between them without any obvious display of confrontation. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his tone polite but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority, "I hope you are enjoying the evening." Margaret's expression shifted immediately into practiced pleasantness, the transformation so smooth Clara might have found it impressive under different circumstances. "Your Grace," she said, dipping into a shallow curtsy. "The evening has been lovely. I was simply catching up with my stepdaughter." "I am glad to hear it," Alexander said, though something in his tone suggested he had heard rather more of the conversation than Margaret might have hoped. "Clara has been telling me a great deal about her family this evening. I find myself quite curious to learn more." Margaret's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I am sure there is little of interest to tell," she said quickly. "Our family is a very ordinary one." "Perhaps," Alexander said, "though I find that ordinary families rarely leave their daughters stranded in freezing weather without so much as a backward glance. I confess, I am curious what circumstance might explain such an oversight." Margaret's composure wavered visibly this time, her eyes darting briefly toward Clara before settling back on Alexander with careful calculation. "It was a simple miscommunication," she said. "Nothing more." "I see," Alexander said, in a tone that made it clear he saw a great deal more than Margaret likely intended. "Well, I shall not keep you from the rest of the evening's festivities, Mrs. Whitmore. I am certain you have much to attend to." Margaret took the dismissal for what it was, offering a stiff curtsy before retreating back into the crowd, though not before casting one final, warning glance toward Clara, a promise of conversations yet to come once the safety of the ballroom no longer shielded her. Clara let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, the tension slowly draining from her shoulders as her stepmother disappeared into the crowd. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "I did not mean for you to become tangled in our family's difficulties." "You need not apologize," Alexander said. "I find myself, if anything, rather more curious about your family's difficulties than I was an hour ago. Beatrice mentioned something to you, did she not, just before I returned? I could not hear the words, but I saw your expression change." Clara hesitated, uncertain how much to share with a man she had known for only a handful of hours, however unexpectedly kind he had proven himself to be. But something in his steady, patient gaze convinced her that honesty, at least with him, was unlikely to be met with cruelty. "She said there were things happening at home that I know nothing about," Clara admitted. "That Margaret has reasons for wanting me kept quiet and out of sight, reasons that have nothing to do with the carriage tonight." Alexander's expression grew thoughtful, a flicker of something sharp and considering passing behind his calm exterior. "That is an interesting thing for a sister to admit," he said, "even in a moment of frustration." "I do not know what it means," Clara said. "I have long suspected there is more happening within my own household than I am permitted to see, but I have never had proof of it, nor any real way to uncover the truth." "Perhaps," Alexander said slowly, "tonight is the beginning of finding it." Clara looked up at him, searching his expression for some hint of what he meant, but found only quiet, thoughtful resolve looking back at her, the same steady certainty that had convinced her, hours ago, to place her hand in his rather than continue her cold, lonely walk home. Whatever secrets Margaret was working so carefully to protect, Clara suspected, standing here now in the golden light of Ashcombe's ballroom, that they would not remain hidden for very much longer. The evening continued to unfold around them, the music shifting from one lively piece to another as guests moved between dancing and conversation with practiced ease. Clara remained close to Alexander's side, though she found herself growing steadily more comfortable navigating the crowded room, offering small greetings to the people he introduced her to, even managing a light laugh or two when the conversation turned playful. It was strange, she thought, how quickly a person could grow accustomed to kindness, when so little of it had come her way in recent years. It was during a brief pause in the dancing, while Alexander had stepped away to speak with his estate steward about some minor matter, that Clara found herself approached by an older woman she did not recognize. The woman moved with quiet elegance, her silver hair swept into an intricate style beneath a modest but clearly expensive headpiece, and her eyes, when they settled on Clara, carried an expression of startled recognition that Clara could not immediately explain. "Forgive me," the woman said, stopping a respectful distance away. "I do not mean to intrude, but you resemble someone I knew a great many years ago, so closely that I confess it startled me rather badly." Clara blinked, uncertain how to respond to such an unexpected observation. "I am Clara Whitmore," she said. I am not certain who you might be thinking of." The woman's expression shifted further, something almost emotional passing behind her composed features. "Whitmore," she repeated softly. "Was your mother, by any chance, named Alina?" Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had not heard her mother's name spoken by a stranger in years, and certainly never with such quiet, careful familiarity. "Yes," she said slowly. "Alina Whitmore. She passed away 6 years ago." The woman's hand rose briefly to her chest, a gesture of genuine, unguarded emotion. "I had heard some years back that she had passed," she said softly. "I am so very sorry. Alina and I were close friends in our younger years before circumstances separated us. My name is Lady Vale. I do not suppose she ever mentioned me." Clara searched her memory carefully but found no recollection of the name. "I am afraid not," she said. "My mother spoke very little of her life before my father, and even less as the years went on. I always assumed there was simply little to tell." Lady Vale's expression grew troubled, a careful consideration passing behind her eyes as though weighing exactly how much to say. "There was a great deal to tell," she said finally, "though I suspect your mother had her reasons for keeping much of it quiet, particularly in the years after her marriage." Clara felt a strange, unsettled curiosity stirring beneath her ribs, the same feeling she had experienced earlier when Beatrice's careless words had hinted at secrets she had never been permitted to see. "What sort of reasons?" she asked carefully. Lady Vale glanced around the crowded ballroom, as though gauging whether the conversation might be overheard, before gently gesturing toward a quieter alcove near one of the tall windows. "Perhaps we might speak somewhere less crowded," she said. "I think there is a great deal you deserve to know, Miss Whitmore, and this is not the place for it." Clara hesitated only a moment before following, her curiosity outweighing whatever caution remained after the strange, difficult events of the evening. They settled into the quiet alcove, the noise of the ballroom softened by distance, and the heavy velvet curtains framing the tall window beside them. "Your mother," Lady Vale began, once they were seated, "was not simply a country gentleman's daughter, as I suspect you have always believed. Alina came from a family with a considerable estate and a respectable title of its own, though not one she inherited directly, being the younger of 2 daughters. When she chose to marry your father, a man of modest means compared to her own family's standing, there was a great deal of disapproval, and I am afraid her family made their displeasure quite clear." Clara sat very still, absorbing this unfamiliar piece of her own history. "I never knew any of this," she said quietly. "My mother never once mentioned a title or an estate or any family beyond my father." "She was proud," Lady Vale said gently, "and hurt, I think, by how quickly her family turned from her once she made her choice. She rarely spoke of them in the years that followed, though she did maintain a small correspondence with me, at least for a time. She was, by all accounts, entitled to a portion of her family's estate upon her passing, set aside for her children, regardless of the earlier disapproval. I do not know whether that inheritance was ever properly settled, given how quietly she passed." Clara's mind raced, pulling together threads she had never before thought to connect. Her father's steady decline in the years following her mother's death, his growing distance and quiet exhaustion, Margaret's arrival into their household not long after, and the strange, sudden tightening of finances that had followed despite the family's continued appearance of respectability. The careful way Margaret controlled every detail of the household's affairs, keeping ledgers and correspondence locked away in her private study, a room Clara had never once been permitted to enter. "I do not believe it was ever settled," Clara said slowly, her voice tight with dawning realization. "I do not believe I was ever told any of this existed at all." Lady Vale's expression grew grave. "That does not surprise me, given what little I have heard of your household circumstances since your mother's passing," she said. "I confess, I had wondered more than once over the years whether I ought to reach out and ensure you were being properly cared for, as your mother's daughter and rightful heir. I am ashamed to admit I did not act on that wondering as I should have." "You need not apologize," Clara said, though her voice trembled slightly with the weight of everything she was learning. "I did not even know there was anything to inquire about." Lady Vale reached out and gently took Clara's hand, her expression softening further. "I would like to help set that right if you will permit me," she said. "I still maintain some connection to your mother's family, distant though it has grown over the years. I believe there are records, documents that would clarify exactly what was owed to you, and whether it was properly handled following Aline's passing. If it was not, Miss Whitmore, that is a matter that can and should be corrected." Clara felt tears prick unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, though she blinked them back quickly, unwilling to let the emotion overwhelm her in the middle of such a crowded, glittering room. "I do not know what to say," she admitted. "This is a great deal to learn in a single evening." "You need say nothing tonight," Lady Vale said kindly. "Simply know that the offer stands whenever you are ready to pursue it. In the meantime, might I ask, does your mother's locket still exist? A small silver piece, engraved with a pair of intertwined initials. She wore it always, in the years I knew her." Clara's hand rose instinctively to her collarbone, where a small silver locket rested beneath the collar of her dress, tucked carefully out of sight as it always was. "I have it," she said softly. "It was among the few things of hers I was permitted to keep. I have worn it every day since she passed." Lady Vale's eyes brightened with quiet recognition. "That locket," she said, "belonged to your mother's own mother before her, passed down as a mark of the family line. If you still possess it, Miss Whitmore, it would serve as meaningful evidence of your connection, should the matter of your inheritance ever require proving." Clara withdrew the locket carefully from beneath her collar, turning it gently in her fingers to reveal the delicate engraving she had traced so many times over the years without ever fully understanding its significance. Lady Vale studied it closely, a soft, sad smile touching her lips. "Yes," she said quietly, "that is the very piece. Aline would be very glad to know you had kept it so carefully all these years." Clara tucked the locket back beneath her collar, her mind still reeling from everything she had just learned. She thought of Margaret's tight, controlling grip over the household's finances, her careful cruelty toward Clara over the years, always just subtle enough to avoid open scandal. She thought of Beatrice's strange, uneasy admission on the dance floor, the hint that there were things happening at home Clara knew nothing about. Slowly, painfully, the pieces began arranging themselves into a picture far more troubling than she had ever suspected. "Do you believe," Clara asked carefully, "that my stepmother has known about this inheritance all along, that she has been the one keeping it from me?" Lady Vale's expression grew careful, measured. "I cannot say with certainty," she said, "but it would explain a great deal, would it not? A household that struggles with money despite maintaining an appearance of comfort. A stepdaughter kept quietly out of sight and out of society, discouraged, perhaps, from ever making the kinds of connections that might lead to precisely the sort of conversation we are having tonight." Clara sat with the weight of that thought for a long moment, old memories rearranging themselves under this new, unsettling light. The years of careful control, the endless small cruelties dressed up as practicality, the constant reminders of her place within a household that had never once felt like her own. It had never simply been about temperament, she realized now, or the ordinary friction of a blended family. It had been about something far more calculated. "I need to know the truth," Clara said finally, her voice steady despite the storm of emotion churning beneath it. "Whatever it costs, whatever it means for my family, I need to know." Lady Vale nodded, a look of quiet approval settling over her features. "Then we shall find it together," she said. "I will make the necessary inquiries as soon as I am able. In the meantime, Miss Whitmore, I would advise a certain amount of caution. If your stepmother has indeed been managing to keep such a significant matter hidden for this long, she will not take kindly to it coming to light, particularly not in such a public and unexpected fashion as tonight has already provided." Clara thought of Margaret's tight, warning expression as she had retreated into the crowd earlier, the promise of a conversation still to come once the safety of the ballroom no longer shielded either of them. She did not doubt, for even a moment, that Lady Vale's warning was well-founded. "Thank you," Clara said softly, "for telling me this, for remembering my mother so kindly after all these years." "Eleanor was a dear friend," Lady Vale said, her eyes glistening slightly in the candlelight. "It is the very least I can do for her daughter, especially now that I have finally had the chance to meet you properly." As Lady Vale rose to rejoin the wider gathering, promising to seek Clara out again before the evening's end, Clara remained seated a moment longer in the quiet alcove, turning the locket gently between her fingers as she absorbed the full weight of everything she had just learned. The night had already carried her further than she ever could have imagined when she sat shivering on that cold stone wall, but she suspected, watching the glittering crowd move beyond the curtain, that the most difficult part of the evening had not yet arrived. She found Alexander a short while later, standing near the refreshment table in quiet conversation with his steward, and something in her expression must have betrayed the weight of what she had learned, for his own expression shifted immediately into careful concern as she approached. "You look troubled," he said quietly once his steward had excused himself. "What has happened?" Clara hesitated only a moment before deciding, with a certainty that surprised her, that she trusted this man enough to share what she had learned. "I believe," she said slowly, "that my stepmother has been hiding something from me for a very long time. Something that may explain a great deal more than simply why I was left in the cold tonight." Alexander's expression grew sharp with attention, all traces of casual conversation falling away entirely. "Tell me," he said. And so, standing quietly at the edge of the glittering ballroom, with the music and laughter continuing on around them, Clara began to explain everything Lady Vale had told her, watching as Alexander's expression grew steadily more resolute with each new detail, as though a plan were already beginning to take careful shape behind his calm, composed features. Alexander listened without interruption, his expression growing steadily more focused as Clara laid out everything Lady Vale had shared, from her mother's hidden family connections to the possibility of a long-buried inheritance, and the troubling suspicion that Margaret had known of it all along. When Clara finished, he was quiet for a long moment, considering the matter with the same careful attention he seemed to bring to everything. "If this is true," he said finally, "it is a far more serious matter than an unkind stepmother and a forgotten carriage seat. Withholding a rightful inheritance is not simply cruelty, Clara. It is theft, and it carries consequences under the law." Clara felt a fresh wave of unease settle over her at the weight of that word. "I do not wish to see anyone punished unfairly," she said quietly. "I only wish to understand the truth and to know whether my mother's wishes were ever honored." "That is a reasonable wish," Alexander said, "but I suspect the truth, once uncovered, may lead somewhere neither of us can yet predict. Are you prepared for that possibility?" Clara considered the question carefully, thinking of her father's tired, distant expression in recent years, of Margaret's careful control over every ledger and correspondence in their household, of the quiet, persistent unease that had followed Clara through her own home for longer than she cared to admit. "I have spent 6 years wondering why everything changed so completely after my mother's passing," she said. "I would rather know the truth, however difficult, than continue living inside a lie I never chose." Alexander's expression softened slightly, something like quiet admiration passing behind his composed features. "Then we shall find it," he said, "together, if you will allow me to help." Before Clara could respond, a familiar voice cut through the noise of the ballroom, sharp and controlled despite its outward pleasantness. "Clara, a word if you please." Margaret stood a short distance away, her expression carefully arranged into polite neutrality for the benefit of anyone watching, though Clara had learned long ago to recognize the tension coiled tightly beneath such a mask. Beside her stood a man Clara did not immediately recognize, tall and thin, dressed in the sort of understated, expensive clothing that suggested wealth without ostentation. His eyes moved over Clara with an assessing sharpness that made her uneasy before he had even spoken a single word. "Miss Whitmore," the man said, offering a shallow, perfunctory bow. "I am Mr. Grant, a solicitor and old family friend. Your stepmother has asked me to join this conversation, given certain matters that require clarification. Clara glanced at Alexander, who had gone very still beside her, his expression carefully composed but no less alert for its calm. "What matters?" Clara asked, keeping her voice steady despite the sudden tightening in her chest. Margaret's smile did not waver, though her eyes carried a warning sharp enough to cut glass. "I understand you have been speaking with Lady Vale this evening," she said, "about matters concerning your mother's family. I thought it best to address any confusion before rumors spread further than they already have." Clara's stomach dropped. Word had traveled quickly indeed, faster than she had anticipated, and she wondered with a flicker of unease exactly how much Margaret already knew about the conversation, and how long she had been watching from a careful distance, waiting for the right moment to intervene. "There is no confusion," Clara said carefully. "Lady Vale simply told me the truth about my mother's family, and about an inheritance that may never have been properly settled." Mr. Grant's expression remained carefully neutral, though something calculating flickered briefly behind his eyes. "I have handled your family's affairs for a number of years, Miss Whitmore," he said smoothly. "I can assure you, all matters relating to your mother's estate were settled appropriately and in accordance with the law at the time of her passing." "Then you will have no objection," Alexander said, speaking for the first time since Margaret's arrival, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority, "to producing the relevant documentation for review. If everything was handled properly, as you claim, there should be nothing troubling in allowing Miss Whitmore to see the records for herself." A brief, tense silence fell over the small group. Margaret's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, and Mr. Grant's composed expression flickered for just a moment before smoothing back into practiced calm. "Such records are typically kept private," Mr. Grant said carefully. "Family financial matters are not generally shared beyond those directly responsible for managing them." "Miss Whitmore," Alexander said pointedly, "is the daughter directly named in the matter under discussion. I would think she has every right to review documentation concerning her own mother's estate. Would you not agree, Mr. Grant?" Clara watched the exchange with a growing sense of unease mixed with something close to gratitude, watching as Alexander pressed steadily against the careful evasions being offered, refusing to let the matter be smoothed over as easily as Margaret clearly hoped it would be. "This is hardly the appropriate setting for such a discussion," Margaret said quickly, her composure fraying at the edges despite her best efforts to maintain it. "Perhaps we ought to continue this conversation at a more suitable time, away from prying ears." "I disagree," Alexander said mildly. "I find that matters handled quietly, away from prying ears, as you put it, are often the very matters most in need of a little honest daylight." Margaret's expression hardened, the polite mask slipping further with each passing moment. "You overstep, Your Grace," she said, her voice tight. "This is a private family matter, and I do not believe it concerns you." "It concerns me," Alexander said, his tone remaining perfectly calm despite the sharpness of his words. "The moment it involves the well-being of a young woman I found abandoned in freezing weather earlier this evening, by the very family now attempting to dismiss legitimate questions about her inheritance." A few nearby guests had begun to notice the tension building within the small group, their conversations quieting as curious glances turned in their direction. Margaret's eyes darted briefly toward the gathering attention, and Clara watched her stepmother's careful composure wage a visible battle against the growing panic beneath it. "Very well," Margaret said finally, her voice tight and controlled. "If you insist on airing family matters in public, Your Grace, then let me be equally direct. There was an inheritance, yes, left to Clara upon her mother's passing. It was managed carefully on her behalf, until she came of proper age to receive it responsibly." "And has she come of proper age?" Alexander asked evenly. "Miss Whitmore is, I believe, 21, old enough, I would think, to manage her own affairs, or at the very least, to be informed of their existence." Margaret's jaw tightened, and beside her, Mr. Grant shifted uncomfortably, his earlier composure crumbling further under the weight of Alexander's steady, unrelenting attention. "The matter is more complicated than a simple question of age," Mr. Grant said carefully. "There were debts, obligations tied to the estate, expenses incurred in Miss Whitmore's own upbringing and care over the years, all of which required careful management against the inheritance in question." Clara felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest at those words. "You mean to say," she said slowly, "that my own inheritance has been spent on my behalf without my knowledge or consent for the past 6 years?" Neither Margaret nor Mr. Grant offered an immediate answer, and their silence spoke louder than any words could have managed. Clara felt the weight of the realization settle over her like a physical thing, heavy and suffocating. 6 years of careful cruelty and cold dismissal, suddenly rearranging themselves into a far darker, more calculated shape than she had ever allowed herself to imagine. "How much remains?" Clara asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Of what my mother left me, how much remains after 6 years of these careful expenses?" "That is a matter best discussed privately," Margaret said quickly, her eyes darting nervously toward the growing cluster of curious onlookers nearby. "I think," Alexander said, his voice carrying just enough to reach the small crowd that had gathered without ever quite raising into something as undignified as a shout, "that Miss Whitmore has waited quite long enough for private answers that never seem to arrive. Perhaps a public one, however uncomfortable, would serve everyone rather better tonight." Margaret's face flushed with a mixture of fury and panic, and for a long, tense moment, Clara thought her stepmother might simply turn and flee the confrontation entirely rather than answer. But the weight of so many watching eyes, the murmurs already spreading through the nearby guests, seemed to leave her little choice but to respond. "Very little remains," Margaret admitted finally, her voice tight and clipped. "The estate required significant upkeep in the years following your father's declining health. Difficult choices had to be made." Clara absorbed the admission with a strange, hollow calm, the anger she expected to feel replaced instead by a quiet, aching clarity. 6 years of careful cruelty, of being made to feel a burden in her own home, while the very money meant to secure her future had been quietly, deliberately drained away. "I would like to see the records," Clara said, her voice steady despite the storm churning beneath it. "All of them, Mr. Grant. Every expense claimed against my inheritance, going back to the year of my mother's passing." Mr. Grant glanced nervously toward Margaret, clearly seeking some sign of how to proceed, but found no guidance in his employer's tightly controlled expression. "I shall need time to gather such extensive records," he said finally, stalling. "Then you have time," Alexander said. "But know that I intend to see this matter through to a proper resolution, Mr. Grant, and I do not believe Miss Whitmore is alone in her interest in seeing it done." The implication hung heavy in the air, and Clara understood, watching the flicker of alarm pass across both Margaret's and Mr. Grant's faces, exactly what Alexander meant by it. His standing, his influence, his very presence beside her, lent a weight to her questions that Margaret's careful control could no longer easily dismiss. Margaret's composure finally shattered entirely, her earlier polite mask giving way to something far more raw and desperate. "You do not understand the difficulties I have faced," she said, her voice trembling with barely controlled emotion. "Raising 3 children, managing a household on dwindling means, watching your father's health decline year after year. I did what was necessary to survive." "You did what was convenient," Clara said quietly, "and called it necessity. There is a difference, and I think you know it." The silence that followed stretched long and uncomfortable, broken only by the distant, incongruous strains of music still drifting from the far end of the ballroom, where guests unaware of the unfolding confrontation continued dancing beneath the glittering chandeliers. Margaret stared at Clara for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes, before turning sharply and disappearing into the crowd without another word, Mr. Grant hurrying after her with a hasty, apologetic bow toward Alexander. Clara stood very still amid the quiet aftermath, feeling the weight of everything she had just learned pressing down upon her, heavy and disorienting. Alexander's hand found hers gently, steadying, and she was grateful in that moment for the simple warmth of his presence beside her. "Are you well?" he asked quietly. "I do not know," Clara admitted. "I feel as though I have spent 6 years standing on ground I believed to be solid, only to learn tonight that it was never solid at all." "You have handled it with a great deal more grace than most would have managed," Alexander said. "And I promise you, Clara, this matter will not simply be allowed to fade quietly away, whatever your stepmother might hope." Clara looked up at him, searching his steady, resolute expression, and felt, despite the exhaustion and heartache of the evening, a small, stubborn flicker of hope beginning to take root where only cold, quiet resignation had lived for so many years before. Alexander guided her away from the thinning crowd near the ballroom entrance, toward a set of tall glass doors that opened onto a quiet stone terrace overlooking the estate's winter gardens. The cold air struck Clara's cheeks the moment they stepped outside, sharp and bracing after the warmth of the crowded room, but she welcomed it, grateful for a moment of stillness after everything the evening had already demanded of her. "I thought you might need a little air," Alexander said, as they walked slowly along the terrace, the muffled sound of music drifting faintly behind them. "It has been a great deal to absorb in a single evening." "It has," Clara agreed softly, wrapping her arms around herself against the chill. "I do not think I fully understand yet what tonight has changed. Only that it has changed a great deal." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the moonlight silvering the frost-covered hedges below the terrace, the distant hoot of an owl echoing faintly across the grounds. Clara found herself stealing occasional glances at Alexander's profile, wondering, not for the first time that evening, why a man of his standing had troubled himself so thoroughly with the difficulties of a stranger he had known for only a handful of hours. "May I ask you something?" she said, finally breaking the quiet. "You may." "Why does this matter so much to you?" Clara asked. "My family's difficulties are not your concern, and yet you have spent the better part of this evening defending me, questioning my stepmother's solicitor, promising to see justice done. I do not understand what I have done to deserve such determined kindness from a man I met only hours ago." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the frost-silvered gardens below, his expression carrying a weight Clara had not seen from him before. "My own mother," he said finally, "faced something not entirely dissimilar many years ago, though the details differed in their particulars." Clara turned to look at him more fully, surprised by the sudden, unguarded honesty in his voice. "What happened to her?" she asked gently. "She was widowed young," Alexander said, "left to manage a household and raise 2 children largely on her own, while distant relatives circled the estate like vultures, eager to claim whatever portion of the inheritance they believed themselves entitled to. She fought them for years, quietly, patiently, often without the support or protection that might have made the fight easier. I watched her exhaust herself defending what rightfully belonged to her children, and I watched too many people around her simply look away, unwilling to involve themselves in what they considered a private family matter." Clara felt something tighten in her chest at the quiet pain still evident beneath his measured words. "I am sorry," she said softly. "That must have been difficult, watching her struggle so." "It was," Alexander said, "and I promised myself, watching her carry that burden largely alone, that if I were ever in a position to help someone facing a similar injustice, I would not simply look away as so many did for her. Tonight, watching your family attempt to dismiss and diminish you in front of an entire ballroom, I recognized something I had hoped never to witness again." Clara absorbed his words slowly, understanding now the depth of conviction behind his earlier interventions, the steady, deliberate way he had pressed against Margaret's careful evasions. It was not simply chivalry, she realized, or even the casual curiosity of a bored aristocrat entertained by an unusual evening. It was something rooted far deeper, born from his own family's difficult history. "Your mother," Clara said carefully, "did she succeed in the end, in protecting what belonged to her children. She did, Alexander said, a faint, proud smile touching the corner of his mouth, though it cost her a great deal of strength and peace of mind along the way. I have always admired her resilience, even as I wished she had not been forced to summon so much of it simply to secure what should never have been questioned in the first place. Clara nodded slowly, understanding settling warm and steady in her chest despite the cold night air. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me that. It helps somehow, knowing your kindness tonight comes from something real, rather than simple curiosity or passing amusement." "It was never simple curiosity," Alexander said, turning to face her fully, his expression earnest in a way that made Clara's breath catch slightly. "From the moment I saw you sitting on that stone wall, Clara, there was something in you I recognized immediately, a quiet strength beneath the exhaustion, a dignity that refused to break despite everything working against it. I do not offer my help lightly, nor to just anyone. I offer it because I believe you deserve far better than what your family has given you, and because, if I am honest, I find myself rather reluctant to let this evening be the last time our paths cross." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest despite the cold, a warmth that had little to do with the terrace's sheltered corner and everything to do with the sincerity in Alexander's voice. "I do not know what to say to that," she admitted softly. "You need not say anything tonight," Alexander said. "There is a great deal still to untangle regarding your family's affairs, and I do not wish to add further complication to an already overwhelming evening. But I would like, with your permission, to help you see this matter through properly. Not simply as a passing act of kindness, but as someone who intends to remain involved for as long as you will allow it." Clara studied his steady, earnest expression, searching for any trace of the careless charm Margaret had warned her against only hours earlier, the kind of practiced attention men of standing sometimes offered women in her position, meant to amuse for an evening and forget entirely by morning. She found none. Only quiet, patient sincerity, the same steady certainty that had guided her through the first dance, that had pressed firmly against her stepmother's evasions without ever raising into cruelty of its own. "I would welcome your help," Clara said finally, "more than I know how to properly express." Something eased in Alexander's expression, relief and quiet pleasure mingling together, as he offered her a small, genuine smile, warmer than any she had yet seen from him that evening. "Then it is settled," he said. "Tomorrow I will send for my own solicitor, a man of considerable skill and unquestionable integrity, to review whatever records Mr. Grant is eventually persuaded to produce. If there has indeed been wrongdoing in the management of your inheritance, we will see it properly addressed, through legitimate and lawful means." "And if my stepmother refuses to cooperate?" Clara asked. "She has shown tonight exactly how far she is willing to go to avoid honest scrutiny." "Then we shall find other means of persuading her," Alexander said, a hint of steel entering his otherwise calm voice. "There are legal avenues available to compel such records, should cooperation not be freely given. I do not believe your stepmother will find those avenues particularly comfortable once properly pursued." Clara felt a fresh wave of gratitude wash over her, tangled together with something warmer and more complicated that she did not yet fully understand. She thought of the long, cold walk that had brought her here, the frozen stone wall where she had sat certain her evening would end in quiet, forgotten disappointment, and marveled at how completely the night had transformed since then. "I still cannot quite believe this is happening," she admitted softly. "Only hours ago, I expected to be walking home alone in the dark, wondering how I would explain my absence to a family that likely would not have noticed it at all." "And now?" Alexander asked. "Now," Clara said, a small, tired smile finally breaking through the weight of the evening's difficulties, "I find myself standing on a terrace with the Duke of Ashcombe, discussing solicitors and inheritance law, having danced the first dance of the season in a gown far too plain for the occasion. I do not think I could have imagined such an evening, even in my most hopeful daydreams." Alexander's smile widened slightly, something warm and unguarded finally breaking through his usual careful composure. "Perhaps," he said, "your most hopeful daydreams simply were not ambitious enough." Clara laughed softly, the sound surprising her with its lightness after everything the evening had demanded. It felt strange and wonderful to laugh so freely after years spent carefully monitoring even her smallest expressions, wary of drawing Margaret's sharp attention or her stepsister's careless mockery. Here, on this quiet terrace beneath the cold winter stars, she felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely herself. "We should return inside," Alexander said eventually, though something in his tone suggested reluctance rather than eagerness. "The cold will not do you any favors, however grateful I am for this conversation." Clara nodded, though she found herself equally reluctant to leave the quiet peace of the terrace for the noise and scrutiny still waiting within. As they turned to walk back toward the glowing windows of the ballroom, Alexander offered his arm once more, and Clara took it without hesitation this time, the earlier uncertainty of the evenings beginning replaced now with something steadier. Something that felt, however new and unfamiliar, remarkably like trust. "Whatever happens with my family," Clara said quietly as they approached the terrace doors, "I want you to know that tonight has already given me something I did not expect to find. Not simply help with the inheritance, though I am deeply grateful for that. Something more than that." Alexander glanced down at her, his expression soft in the dim light spilling from the ballroom windows. "And what is that?" he asked. "Proof," Clara said, "that kindness still exists in the world, freely given, without expectation of anything in return. I had nearly forgotten that, living so long inside my stepmother's house." Alexander was quiet for a moment, something thoughtful and warm passing behind his composed expression. "Then I am glad to have reminded you of it," he said softly. "Though I confess, Clara, I find myself hoping this will not be the last reminder I have the chance to offer." Clara felt her cheeks warm despite the cold night air, and as they stepped back through the terrace doors into the golden light and music of the ballroom, she allowed herself, for the first time in a very long while, to simply enjoy the warmth of hope without immediately searching for the disappointment that so often followed close behind it. They had barely stepped back into the warmth of the ballroom when a new commotion near the entrance caught Clara's attention, a ripple of movement and hushed conversation spreading among the nearest guests. She turned toward the sound, her heart lurching unexpectedly as she recognized the familiar figure making his way through the crowd, his expression drawn with the particular exhaustion of a long journey. "My father," Clara said softly, surprise coloring her voice. "I did not expect him to arrive so late." Edward Whitmore moved through the ballroom with the tired, distracted air of a man who had spent the evening occupied with matters far removed from dancing and conversation, his eyes scanning the crowd until they finally settled on Clara, standing beside Alexander near the terrace doors. His expression shifted through several emotions in quick succession, confusion giving way to relief, and finally to something like dawning concern as he took in the sight of his daughter, clearly present and clearly unharmed, despite having been told, Clara suspected, an entirely different account of the evening's events. "Clara," he said, closing the distance between them quickly, "I was told you had chosen to remain home this evening, feeling unwell. I confess, I did not expect to find you here at all." Clara exchanged a brief glance with Alexander before answering, choosing her words carefully. "That is not quite what happened, Father," she said. "I was left behind when the carriage departed without proper transportation of my own." His Grace was kind enough to notice, and offered his assistance in bringing me here. Edward's expression darkened with a confusion that quickly sharpened into concern as the full weight of Clara's careful words settled over him. "Left behind," he repeated slowly. "In this cold. Clara, why did no one send word to me directly?" "I do not believe that was ever the intention," Alexander said evenly, stepping forward to offer a polite but firm bow. "Mr. Whitmore, I am Alexander, Duke of Ashcombe. I found your daughter sitting alone outside my gates this evening. in whether I would not have left even a stranger to endure unassisted. Edward's face paled slightly as understanding dawned more fully, his gaze flicking toward Margaret, who had reappeared at the edge of the group, her earlier composure now visibly strained beneath the weight of her husband's unexpected arrival and obvious confusion. "Margaret," Edward said slowly, "you told me Clara had chosen to stay behind of her own accord. Why would you tell me such a thing if it were not true?" Margaret's composure wavered, her eyes darting nervously between her husband and Alexander, clearly searching for some explanation that might smooth over the mounting evidence of her deception. "There was simply a misunderstanding about the carriage," she said, her voice tight and unconvincing even to Clara's own ears. "I did not think it worth troubling you with such a small matter." "A small matter," Edward repeated, his voice carrying a weight of disbelief that Clara had rarely heard from him in recent years. "My daughter, left alone in freezing weather, is not a small matter, Margaret." Clara watched her father's expression carefully, searching for some sign of the old, exhausted resignation that had characterized so much of his behavior in recent years. The quiet, weary distance that had allowed Margaret's careful control to grow so thoroughly unchecked within their household. She found, instead, something she had not seen from him in a very long time: genuine, unguarded anger. "There is more, father," Clara said quietly, deciding the moment had come to share the full weight of what she had learned that evening, however difficult the conversation might prove. "I learned tonight that my mother left me an inheritance upon her passing, one that was meant to be properly managed until I came of age. I have been told very little of it remains." Edward's face went entirely still, the color draining further from his already pale complexion. "What inheritance?" he asked slowly, turning toward Margaret with an expression that had shifted from anger into something far colder and more calculating. "I was never informed of any such arrangement." Margaret's carefully constructed composure finally shattered entirely under the combined weight of her husband's confusion and Clara's quiet, steady accusation. "I handled it as I believed best," she said, her voice rising slightly with barely suppressed panic. "The household required significant funds over the years, Edward, particularly during your illness. I did what was necessary to keep this family afloat." "Without ever once informing me," Edward said, his voice dangerously quiet now, "that such funds existed or that you had been drawing upon my daughter's inheritance to manage them." The small group had drawn considerable attention by this point, nearby guests pausing their own conversations to watch the unfolding confrontation with poorly concealed curiosity. Clara felt a flicker of the old instinct to shrink away from such public scrutiny, but found it quickly overtaken by a steadier, more resolute feeling, the same quiet strength that had carried her through the evening's earlier confrontations. "I believe," Alexander said, his voice calm but carrying enough weight to cut cleanly through the tension, "that this matter would benefit from a full and formal review, conducted properly and away from the understandable emotion of this evening. I have already offered Miss Whitmore my solicitor's assistance in examining the relevant records. I would extend that same offer to you, Mr. Whitmore, given your evident and rightful concern." Edward turned toward Alexander, something like grateful relief passing briefly across his tired features. "I would welcome that assistance, Your Grace," he said. "I confess, I have been far too absent from the details of my own household's affairs these past years, a failing I intend to correct immediately." Margaret's eyes widened with fresh alarm at her husband's words, the full weight of what a formal review might uncover clearly settling over her for the first time. "Edward," she said, her voice softening into something almost pleading, "surely we can discuss this privately, away from such public attention. There is no need to involve solicitors and formal reviews over what is, at its heart, simply a family matter." "You called our daughter's safety a small matter only moments ago," Edward said, his voice hardening once more. "I find I have very little patience left for hearing what else you might wish to dismiss as merely private family business, Margaret. If the records are honest, you have nothing to fear from a proper review. If they are not, then I think we both know exactly why you are so eager to avoid one." A heavy silence settled over the small group, broken only by the distant, incongruous music still drifting from the far end of the ballroom. Clara watched her father's expression carefully, seeing in it a resolve she had not witnessed in years, a steady, deliberate strength that seemed to have been summoned entirely by tonight's difficult revelations. "I am sorry, Clara," Edward said finally, turning back toward his daughter, his expression heavy with genuine regret. "I should have paid closer attention to what was happening within my own household. I allowed my grief over your mother's passing to distance me from responsibilities I ought never to have neglected, and I fear you have paid the price for that neglect far more than anyone else." Clara felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion at her father's words, the first genuine acknowledgement of the difficult years she had endured that she had received from him since her mother's passing. "Thank you for saying that," she said softly. "It means more than you know." Edward reached out and gently took her hand, the gesture carrying a warmth Clara had nearly forgotten he was capable of expressing. "I intend to make this right," he said, "whatever it takes and however long it requires. You deserve far better than what these past years have given you, and I do not intend to fail you further." Margaret, watching the exchange with growing desperation, seemed to recognize finally that her earlier control over the household's narrative had crumbled entirely beyond repair. "This is madness," she said, her voice tight with barely restrained panic. "You would take the word of a solicitor and a stranger over your own wife, over the years I have devoted to this family." "I would take honest records over careful excuses," Edward said simply. "And I think, Margaret, that a woman confident in her own honesty would not fight quite so hard against the prospect of proving it." The confrontation drew to a natural, exhausted pause, Margaret retreating once more into the crowd with Mr. Grant hurrying nervously behind her, while Edward remained beside Clara, his expression a careful mixture of guilt and quiet determination. Alexander stood close by, offering the steady, silent support that had carried Clara through the evening's most difficult moments. "I would like to take you home tonight," Edward said to Clara, once the immediate tension had eased. "Properly, in my own carriage, as I should have ensured from the very beginning of this evening." Clara glanced briefly at Alexander, feeling a small, unexpected pang of reluctance at the thought of the evening drawing to its close. "I would like that," she said to her father, before turning toward Alexander with a soft, grateful smile. "Thank you for everything tonight. I do not believe I can properly express how much your kindness has meant to me." "You need not express it fully tonight," Alexander said, his own expression warm despite the formal composure he maintained in front of her father. "I intend to call upon you properly in the coming days, Miss Whitmore, to continue assisting with the matter of your inheritance, and if you will permit it, for rather less formal reasons as well." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest at the quiet promise in his words, and she found herself nodding before she had fully considered how such an answer might sound in front of her father. "I would welcome that," she said simply. Edward glanced between the two of them with a small, knowing expression that suggested he understood rather more of the evening's undercurrents than either of them had explicitly stated. "Your Grace," he said, offering a proper bow, "I am deeply grateful for your kindness toward my daughter tonight. I hope you will forgive the difficult circumstances of our first proper meeting." "There is nothing to forgive," Alexander said. "I am simply glad to have been in the right place at the right moment. I look forward to continuing our acquaintance under considerably calmer circumstances, Mr. Whitmore." As Clara prepared to leave with her father, she turned back once more toward Alexander, finding him watching her with an expression of quiet, steady warmth that settled something deep and unfamiliar into place within her chest. The evening had begun with abandonment, cold and humiliating, and yet here she stood now, at its close, having found not only an unexpected champion, but the first real hope in years that her life might yet be reshaped into something far better than the quiet, careful existence she had grown resigned to enduring. "Good night, Clara," Alexander said softly, as she stepped toward the door beside her father. "Good night," she replied, the word carrying a warmth entirely at odds with the cold night air waiting beyond the ballroom's tall windows. As the Whitmore carriage finally pulled away from Ashcombe Hall, carrying Clara safely home for the first time in the same vehicle as her own family, she looked back once at the golden glow of the estate's windows, still glittering warmly against the dark winter sky, and allowed herself, cautiously and completely, to believe that tomorrow might finally bring the beginning of something better. The weeks that followed unfolded with a steady, determined pace that left Clara barely enough time to catch her breath, let alone dwell too long on the uncertainty that had defined so much of her life before that fateful, freezing night. Alexander's solicitor, a sharp and thorough man named Mr. Ellison, arrived at the Whitmore estate within days, accompanied by Edward's own renewed attention to matters he had neglected for far too long. Together, they began the slow, careful work of untangling years of carefully hidden records. What they found confirmed everything Clara had feared, and a great deal more besides. Margaret had indeed drawn steadily upon Clara's inheritance over the years, disguising the withdrawals within a maze of household expenses that Mr. Grant had helped obscure through careful, deliberate mismanagement of the estate's books. The full sum recovered proved smaller than what Clara's mother had originally intended to leave her, though Mr. Ellison assured her, with quiet confidence, that a fair portion could still be reclaimed through proper legal channels, particularly given Mr. Grant's evident complicity in the deception. Margaret did not weather the revelations gracefully. Faced with the mounting evidence and Edward's newly resolute insistence on transparency, she first attempted denial, then tearful justification, and finally, when neither approach softened her husband's determination, cold, bitter silence. Edward, for his part, did not turn his household upside down in cruelty or vengeance, but he did insist, firmly and without room for further negotiation, that control of the family's finances be placed under proper, independent oversight going forward, with Clara's rightful inheritance ring-fenced and protected from any further interference. Beatrice, to Clara's quiet surprise, sought her out privately not long after the matter became fully known throughout the household, offering an apology that felt, for the first time in years, genuinely uncertain rather than carefully performed. "I did not know the full extent of it," Beatrice admitted, her usual sharp confidence replaced by something more subdued. "I suspected there were difficulties, but I never imagined Mother had gone quite so far. I am sorry, Clara, for the years I spent making things harder for you rather than easier." Clara accepted the apology carefully, neither rushing to forgive entirely nor holding onto old resentments more tightly than they deserved. Trust, she had learned, was not something rebuilt in a single conversation, however sincere, but she found herself willing, cautiously, to allow the possibility of a better relationship with her stepsister in the months ahead. Lucy, younger and less burdened by years of active unkindness, adjusted more easily, seeming almost relieved that the household's careful pretense of comfortable stability had finally been allowed to crack open into something more honest. The three young women found themselves, in the weeks that followed, navigating an unfamiliar, cautious sort of peace, built slowly from small kindnesses rather than the sudden warmth of reconciliation. Alexander, true to his word, called upon Clara within days of the ball, and continued to do so with a steady, unhurried regularity that gradually transformed from formal visits regarding her inheritance into something warmer and far more personal. They walked together through the gardens of Ashcombe on clear afternoons, discussing everything from her mother's history to his own quiet hopes for the estate's future, and Clara found herself, with each visit, trusting more deeply the steady, patient kindness that had first drawn her to accept his hand on that cold, unforgettable night. "I have been thinking," Alexander said one afternoon, as they walked along the same terrace where they had first spoken so honestly about his mother's difficult history, "about what you said the night of the ball, about proof that kindness still exists in the world freely given." "I remember," Clara said, smiling softly at the memory. "I find myself wanting to offer you rather more than proof of kindness," Alexander said, stopping and turning to face her fully, his expression carrying a nervous sincerity Clara had not seen from him before. "I would like to offer you a lifetime of it if you will have me." Clara's breath caught, understanding immediately the weight behind his careful words. "Alexander," she said softly, "are you asking what I believe you are asking?" "I am," he said, reaching for her hand with the same steady, patient certainty he had shown from their very first meeting. "I know we have known each other only a matter of months, and I know the circumstances of our meeting were unusual, to say the very least. But I have not doubted, not for a single day since that cold night, that you are the person I wish to build my life beside. Will you marry me, Clara?" Clara felt tears gather unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, though this time they carried none of the old, familiar weight of sorrow that had so often accompanied her tears in years past. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with quiet, overwhelming joy. "Yes, I will marry you." Their wedding took place the following spring, in the same grand ballroom where they had first danced together beneath the glow of countless candles, though this time the room was filled with genuine warmth rather than curious whispers, and Clara stood at its center not as an uninvited stranger in a patched blue dress, but as a bride surrounded by people who had come to celebrate, sincerely, the life she was beginning. Lady Vale attended, of course, seated proudly near the front with tears of genuine happiness in her eyes, having become, over the preceding months, something of a cherished friend and mentor to Clara, as she navigated the unfamiliar world her mother's family had once belonged to. Edward walked his daughter down the aisle with a steadiness and pride that had been entirely absent from their relationship in the years following Alina's passing, and Clara felt, watching his proud, emotional expression, that some of the distance grief had carved between them had finally, gently, begun to heal. Even Beatrice and Lucy attended, seated quietly among the gathered guests, their presence a small, imperfect symbol of a family slowly, carefully rebuilding itself from the wreckage of old deceptions. Margaret did not attend. She and Edward had separated quietly in the months following the inheritance scandal, the trust between them too thoroughly broken to repair, though Edward ensured, with the same newfound resolve that had guided him through the difficult weeks after the ball, that Margaret's future comfort would not come at the further expense of either of his daughters. As Clara stood beside Alexander at the front of the crowded ballroom, exchanging vows beneath the same glittering chandeliers that had witnessed their very first dance together, she found herself thinking, with quiet wonder, of the cold stone wall where this entire unlikely story had begun. She thought of the carriage wheels cracking against frozen stone, the biting wind against her thin shawl, the aching loneliness of watching her family disappear into the darkness without so much as a backward glance. She thought, too, of the steady, unhurried kindness of a stranger who had chosen to stop his carriage rather than pass by, who had offered his hand without demanding anything in return, who had stood firmly beside her through every difficult revelation that followed, never once wavering in his quiet, patient support. "You seem lost in thought," Alexander murmured, leaning close as the ceremony drew toward its joyful conclusion, the assembled guests rising in warm, genuine applause around them. "I was simply remembering," Clara said softly, "how very different this ballroom feels tonight compared to the first time I ever stood within it." "And how does it feel now?" Alexander asked, his eyes warm with quiet affection. "Like home," Clara said simply, and found as she said the words that she meant them completely. Outside, beyond the tall windows of Ashcombe Hall, the winter had finally given way to the gentle warmth of early spring, the frost-covered gardens that had once framed Clara's loneliest night now blooming steadily with new growth, patient and certain, exactly as new beginnings so often are. And as Clara took her husband's arm and turned to face the warm, familiar glow of the ballroom she had once entered as a frightened, forgotten stranger, she understood, with quiet, settled certainty, that the coldest night of her life had somehow, unexpectedly, become the very beginning of everything good that followed.